Hi, welcome, and thanks for joining me. I'm Coach Erica, and today I'm going to talk about how to read a poem. So let me just give you a little bit of info here. I like to use colors. You will always see me with lots of colors nearby, and that just helps me stay organized. It's also fun and entertaining. A little bit about me. I have been a teacher for 17 years. I've taught AP Language, and I've taught AP Lit. And one of the things that I've noticed a deficit in with many students is that they're not great at reading poetry, nor are they great at studying it and analyzing it. So today, that's what we're going to talk about, a few things. So number one, let's change colors. Number one, we're going to cover how to read a poem. Secondly, we're going to talk about how to study one. And third, how to analyze. So you might say to yourself, well, isn't study and analyze the same thing? And from my view, I say no. And the reason for that is that studying is making meaning, whereas analyzing is making a claim. Okay, so in the end, after we do the reading and the studying, we're always going to come up with an analysis. When you do your AP writing, it always says that you need to identify the theme and support it, right? If you don't come to this analysis point, this is what it means, that's your theme, then you can't pass that section of the essay. So we always have to come up with a theme. In other videos, when I'm analyzing the poem, we will always come up with some themes because, well, that's the point of it. We have to come up with a meaning. What does this say to me? All right. Now I want to cover a few things, a few terms. The first term is enjambment. And enjambment is when there's no punctuation of the line. Sorry, you're gonna have to live with my writing. And the other word is, the other term is end stop. And that's when there's punctuation at the end. Okay, now the reason I'm going over these two terms is that they greatly influence how we read a poem. And we want to read the poem how the poet intended it to be read. So, one of my pet peeves, and I can't be angry at students if they don't know, but it's when students don't read the poem as it should be read. So one of the first things I do when I teach poetry is how to read the poem. So we're going to start with a favorite of mine. It's called The Death of the Balteric Gunner. And notice that there are end stops, right? At the end of every line, there's some kind of punctuation, which tells the reader, you should pause. But there's also punctuation inside right here, and we need to pause there as well. So we want to honor all the punctuation. Now, there's also going to be cases where natural speech causes us to pause because that's what we do after certain syntactical things. We pause, right? After, if I do, according to, we know there's going to be a comma there or a pause after that. So we have to think about natural speech as well, which is why when you are reading a poem, you're going to need to read it lots of times. Don't just read through once in your head. You've just killed the poem right there. Poems are meant, one, to be seen. I'm going to add that really fast to our notes. and heard. I like punctuation marks because I just want to yell certain things all the time. But truly, poems are meant to be seen and heard. We've all seen poems that are shapes. We all know that certain poems, never mind, not going there. I'll talk about that later. A sonnet, that's what I was going to talk about. Sonnets are square, so on and so forth. All right. So when we come to the poem, we're going to read it. And I'm going to come back to this poem about a few other points, but let's read this one according to the end stops, the punctuation, and natural speech patterns. I also want to point out that I've read this poem hundreds of times. I teach this poem every year to students because I love this poem, and students, when it's a great poem to teach how to read a poem and how to study a poem because it has so many layers. It is the proverbial onion of poems. The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Okay, so notice how I paused in places where there isn't punctuation, and that's because that construction requires a pause, right? And oftentimes, if I were writing, I would put a comment after when I died. But he hasn't done that here. But because I know that there's a pause after that, I'm going to naturally do it. Okay, let's look at another poem that tends to trip students up in the reading and the looking. Okay, so remember, we want to notice a poem first. And we want to notice anything that's out of the ordinary with it. So this one, This Is Just to Say by William Carlos Williams, when we look at it, we notice some things right away. Now, if this was in a book, like your textbooks, let's say, these lines would be all single spaced, but there would still be a large gap between the stanzas because that's the way the author designed it. When I redo these for my students, I always put extra spaces in there for our notes and our analysis. So sorry about that, but keep that in mind that these are stanzas. So we have 3 stanzas. The other thing that I noticed right away is how short the lines are, right? It's hardly any words. And it's just like, well, like verbal diarrhea here because there's no punctuation. So I'm going to have to really rely on my knowledge of language and how language works in order to read this. So let's try this. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold. So you notice that I have a lot of pausing happening there, and I'm going to admit I've read this poem hundreds of times. So in my head, I have my own way of reading it based on my analysis of the poem. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you're reading something cold, you're probably going to have to read it out loud 6 to 10 times before you finally find a rhythm, right? Because that's what it takes. You have to find the rhythm that you feel the words are speaking to you. This one, forgive me, right? It's a directive and it's being spoken to someone. So we know that there's going to be a pause there. Forgive me, right? That's how we say it. So let's come back to, notice I've got some steps here for you. But let's come back to how to read a poem, right? So first, we're going to find a new color. Notice. Shape. Anything out of the ordinary. And what does that mean? Well, maybe funny words are capitalized, like in The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, the word state is capitalized. That makes me go, why is that capitalized, right? We should be asking those questions. I'm noticing the shape here. I'm seeing that there's only a few words on each line. And there's really not a whole lot of words here altogether. In fact, this is basically 2 or 3 sentences. Okay, so think about that. So we want to notice things. We want to notice the shape. We want to notice anything out of the ordinary. Sometimes a word is italicized. Sometimes a word is in quotes. Sometimes there's words in parentheses. So we want to be noticing these things. And then we want to wonder, right? Wonder, ask questions. Why? Why would the author write it like that? What is the poet's intention? We need to get into these things because that's what leads us into the next part, the studying part, are these questions. Because when we form these questions, we're able to realize where we need to go next. All right, so read the poem aloud several times. Notice what the poem's looking like. Notice these other things that are happening in the poem. The next thing we want to do is we want to start studying. So if I were teaching you The Death of the Bald Turret Gunner, which you can check another video for the analysis of that, I would start saying, okay, let's look up this word, let's look up this word, let's look up this word, and I would assign a whole bunch of words, probably 10, for us to look up in the dictionary. Now, when we look it up in the dictionary, right, we don't want to use the first definition we come across. And there's a reason for this. So if I am studying this one over here, this Walt Whitman, look at when it was written, right? Early 19th century. Do you think the way certain words used in the early 19th century necessarily mean the same as they mean now in this century, right? Words change, the meanings change. And so you have to be a little more careful about the dictionary work that you do. If you're going to be online, then I recommend using the Oxford English Dictionary so that you can browse down through the definitions to find the one or maybe multiples that possibly will work with the poem. I prefer a real dictionary myself, but that's up to you. The other thing to keep in mind, and a lot of people don't know this, is that the first definition in the dictionary is the most commonly used one at that time that the dictionary was made. So if you're looking at a dictionary from 2020, then you're getting 2020's most commonly used definition. That's probably not going to work for a 19th or 18th or 17th century text. So we have to be really careful and we have to be investigators, right? So that's why there's all this space, is that you can now start making notes. You can write your definitions, you can write your thoughts about things, and you should be doing that when you're studying. Start asking your questions, write them down, put the answers, put your definitions. You're also going to be thinking about the figurative language. You're going to be looking at symbology. You're going to be looking at metaphors, right? All these different pieces. And then you also want to be thinking about, so we're going to put figurative language here. Language. We also want to think about the sounds, right? The sound of the poem is really important. So awesome example right here. I woke to black flack. If I read that, I might not hear it, but when I have to read it out loud, I understand how it sounds. And we also get the sense of black flack. I woke to black flack. All those K's tell us that, well, there's some cacophony happening here. And this is about war. So when I hear black flak, it actually makes me think of gunfire. And when you look up the word flak, you might confirm that that's what I'm hearing. But the poet is doing this on purpose, right? There's no accidents. Poets, they're using language in a way that we don't know how to use it, most of us anyway, on a regular basis, right? They're taking the fewest words to give us the greatest meaning. That's why everything is so incredibly intentional. Never think there's accidents when it comes to poetry, ever. That would be just, oh, so offensive to a poet. Now, the last piece that we're going to look at, let me make sure I hit all the notes. We also want to study the organization. Now, this doesn't apply to all poems, but some poems definitely, put that I in there, some poems definitely have an organization and it's designed that way. So when you start getting into sonnets and the way some of the other poems are written, depending on their rhyme scheme and their meter, you start to see patterns and how those patterns work together. So when we study a poem, one of those poems, I'll bring that up then. And then lastly, we're going to analyze. So we're going to determine a theme. And you know what? There's never just one. So keeping in mind how we all are bringing our own degree of experience, knowledge, expertise, etc., we're going to have different levels of themes. So some are going to be maybe a little more simplistic and others are going to be really complex. And I always challenge students when they come up with the theme, like, oh, it's about heartbreak, or don't trust people because your heart's going to get broken. And then I say, okay, there's our starting point. Let's dig deeper. And we start to dig deeper and we start looking at the evidence, and we find that there's actually always a very complex theme as well. And we're going to work towards that. We'll have all these layers. And when it comes time for writing, you can choose the theme that resounds the most with you. Okay? All right, so let's wrap up. When you're reading a poem, one, you want to look at it, you want to notice it, you want to see the poem, right? What does it look like? What's standing out with it? What's the shape? So what's standing out in it? Sorry. What's the shape of it? So on and so forth. Then you want to read it aloud, right? So I forgot to put that there, but I'm going to add it. You want to read aloud multiple times. Oops. Until you get comfortable with the sound of it. Okay, it needs to be flowing off your tongue. And then you're going to study it. You're going to take it apart. You're going to look up some words. You're going to start asking questions. You're going to be searching for answers to that question. You're going to be looking at the figurative language. You're going to look at how the sounds interact with each other, so on and so forth. You are not going to go online and look at anyone else's thoughts on this, because you know what? They don't matter. What matters are your thoughts. Who cares how this person analyzes it? That should be absolutely irrelevant to you. What should be relevant to you is how you analyze it, how you make meaning, and what the meaning is that you come up with. So yeah, I'm probably kind of saying don't listen to me when I go through this analysis of these other poems, but at the same time, watching somebody, an expert, that would be me, analyzing a poem should inspire you to look deeper and eventually not need me anymore, right? That's the idea. That's where I'm trying to get you to, is so that you can do it on your own. Now, me personally, I like to see what other people think because I like to compare my own thoughts to them. Sometimes I laugh at their analysis because they're so off base in my mind. But hey, like I said, if we can support it from the text, then that's a valid analysis, all right? Last, you're going to analyze, and that is you're going to determine a theme or themes, right? We're going to pull all that meaning back together and come up with an ultimate life lesson, if you want to call it that. Okay, I hope you learned something today. If you have any other questions that I need to cover, go ahead and type them in the comments. I really appreciate that. Otherwise, keep reading and join me on another day.